I'm excited to have Donald come and present. When we were talking ahead of his presentation, he talked a lot about the explosion of the internet in like the early 90s and how that changed, and so many businesses came of it. And this is very similar. As we mentioned before, there's a lot of people that, as people mentioned, there's a lot of people that have tried to get into the industry and it's failed. I'm sure you've heard lots of stories or been involved in lots of stories of people that have really taken the leap and then something didn't work out. And the other thing that's interesting is there's so many different opportunities, marketing and accounting and infusions. And so Donald's going to talk about all the changes that are happening and how that affects the social entrepreneurship. And so Donald, where he began as a junior high school teacher, he's now the executive director at a program at Pacific Oaks College. He's a very prominent person in the community. We're excited to have him present. So please give a warm welcome for Donald Grant.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, greetings, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I've been walking around trying to kind of let everybody know this is not going to be a talk about how to make millions of dollars on cannabis. And so I will not be offended if you got up and walked away right now. I'm Donald Grant. I work at Pacific Oaks College. I run a small boutique training and consulting firm as well. I'm a film writer. I'm an author. I do book consultations and TV adaptations on kind of cultural things. And if anybody saw the movie Green Book, I hope no investors for that film are here. If you are, I apologize for what I'm about to say. If anybody saw the movie Green Book, one of my taglines is taken from Trevor Noah: I help you to not Green Book that. And so my area of expertise is surrounding culture and a variety of other things. I practice as a clinical psychologist overseeing foster care systems for LA County Department of Mental Health for years before going solely into academia. Right now, I run the Center for Community and Social Impact at Pacific Oaks College, which is our effort to push our mission into the community and not just provide a great education for adult learners, but to actually, as an entity, do things. And so this is an area that I'm really interested in and passionate about, and you'll see why. It's going to have a very ethno-cultural slant to it, and I'd encourage you all, as you kind of listen to the presentation, to practice a little bit of mindfulness and kind of pay attention to what you're experiencing as you consume the content, meaning that sometimes you'll feel uneasy, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because that's what halts social entrepreneurship so much, is kind of those experiences that we don't pay good attention to. So let's try to do that as we talk, and I'll check in with you guys and as we go along. And so, all right, let's get started. So when we talk about social entrepreneurs, and many in the room, for what I gathered through some talking and conversation, are entrepreneurs that don't necessarily identify themselves as social entrepreneurs, right? And so when you look at the difference, we're talking primarily about profit. What a lot of people don't understand is that there can be a both and these two things can live in the same house and coexist really, really well. The problem is that people in certain disciplines don't necessarily get information and understand kind of a history of constructs that may compel them to behave in a different business way, to utilize a different business lens. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And it's going to be a lot of content, a lot of history that we're going to kind of drill through really quickly. But I find that foundation is really critical for the conversation that we'll have at the end, which has no slides. It's just a conversation about what it looks like, what we can do. And so you all are individuals who have garnered some level of success in some area, some arena. And so you're all familiar with this construct of a business continuity plan, right? Something that you do in case of an emergency, in case of a change in the environment or the ecology, to make sure that whatever it is that you're doing remains sustainable across time, right? And so there's this great book called The Cotton Supply of the United States, and it talks about how during the times of the cotton trade, during the transatlantic slave trade, and afterwards, a global economy had been created like no other ever in the world, right? And so anybody ever heard of Lancashire? It's a town in the UK. Lancashire was the center. Oh, somebody's from there. No, I'm just joking. Lancashire was the center of the cotton industry. And when I say center, this was an industry where over 85% of the people who lived there had some kind of connection to the cotton industry, whether they made textiles, whether they ran a mill or whatever it was, they had some connection. And so what we know is that the Emancipation Proclamation was coming and the Civil War was coming. And we knew that a major part of this global economy was based on a free labor system that existed. What I'm going to lay out today for you all is the consistency with which our country uses a business continuity model to maintain certain standards, and how you as social entrepreneurs with this new industry that the world has never seen before have a responsibility to pay attention to and dismantle these particular entities that exist. And so, again, we're looking at an opportunity to gain some information and say, how can I use that with my own acumen in this business world to not just build financial capital, but to build social capital that ultimately results in an improvement in my bottom line. And so identify risk and assessment, analyze business impact, create strategy and develop plan, measure, test, train, and maintain. And so a statement made by English businessmen: cotton can only be cultivated extensively in the southern states by Negro labor, and Negro labor can only be controlled under the semi-patriarchal system called slavery. The great question now before our people is how to appropriate all the African labor of our country. When we talk about a business continuity model, these millionaires understood that this industry was going to end very soon if they didn't have something in place to continue it. And so when we look at what this business continuity model looked like, there were these constructs after enslavement called convict, leasing, and debt peonage, and then the prison industrial complex that many of us are very familiar with right now. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Are you guys familiar with the construct of convict, leasing, and debt peonage? You guys know what that is? So some of you have, some of you have never heard of it, right? And so we'll go through it. And I want you to see this from the lens of saying, I have this set of free labor and I'm about to lose it. Millions of dollars are riding on this. America supplied over 80% of the cotton to the entire world, not just domestically. This is a big business about to end. And any of you who've been part of big business understand that the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, a memo would have gone out. Emergency, we need to meet. Come to the conference room right now, right? Really, right? If that was going on, that's what would happen in the contemporary business. All the C-suite members would be in a room talking about, guys, what are we going to do? And that's what actually happened in the United States. What they came up with was convict, leasing, and debt peonage. And so let's talk a little bit about those. So you can look up these two gentlemen, John S. Williams and Clyde Manning. In 1921, John S. Williams was still holding enslaved people on a plantation in rural Georgia. In 1920, I'm not making this stuff up. You can Google it. Not that Google is automatic. You can look it up in a reference. I'm an academic. I can't reference Google or Wikipedia. So this gentleman was holding people enslaved into 1920s. Keep in mind, historically black colleges had existed. Black people had already gained PhDs. Black Greek letter organizations were already in existence. And these people were still enslaved under this construct of debt peonage. So it means that if I owe you $5, somebody can sell me to a person and they pay me that $5 and I have to serve them as an enslaved person until that debt is paid off. Problem being is that these individuals had children, and for generations, nobody's coming to them and saying, hey guys, slavery ended 60 years ago. So two men escaped from this plantation into Atlanta, got in contact with some attorneys. The attorneys and the lawyers came to this plantation, began to interview the people who were still being enslaved there up into the 1920s. After they left, John made Clyde murder all 11 enslaved people such that there was no evidence of them being enslaved. They went to court, and John was the second white man in America to be charged and convicted for killing a black person. Second, 1921. And I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm certain that there have been white people who have killed black people before 1921. And so when we look at what this meant and we look at how this continued to happen, then we move into this concept called convict leasing. Convict leasing came about in 1866. Well, 1865, we had the Emancipation Proclamation signed, or 1863 Emancipation Proclamation signed. 1865 was the addition of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which made slavery illegal. And then suddenly in 1866, what we call black codes pop up. In 1844, states began the convict leasing program, meaning that you got people who are incarcerated, plantations and different businesses could lease those convicts to do the work. So building railroads and things like that. This was another part of the business continuity plan, this convict leasing. But they said, we don't have enough convicts that to fulfill what's lost on the plantation. So, remember, these are all the C-suite executives of America together because the business is about to close, right? What do? We need more convicts to lease out to the plantation so they can have low labor costs. And so what happened was they created these black codes and vagrancy laws that said, if you look homeless, you can get arrested. If you look like you don't have a job, you can get arrested. If you look like you're wandering, you can get arrested. Well, I was just enslaved last week. How would I not look like I was homeless or I didn't have a job? So these men would be picked up off the street, locked up. And when we look at kind of the statistics, and I won't go through them all, there's a lot to be said on how this worked and how much states made by re-enslaving black men. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, some people hear this and they're kind of like, I don't get it. I don't buy it. But these are statistical facts that happen in our country. And when you look at anybody who runs a business, the goal is to maintain the sustainability of your business. This was a business model that was deliberately created to maintain an oppression over a certain group, to maintain a business model. Literally to maintain a business model. And so Slavery by Another Name is another great book that I'd encourage you guys to get to kind of gain some more information on these pieces. Convict leasing was nonetheless slavery, a system in which armies of free men guilty of no crimes and entitled by law to freedom were compelled to labor without compensation, were repeatedly bought and sold, and were forced to do the bidding of white masters through the regular application of extraordinary physical coercion. It's a quote from the book. And one of the most interesting pieces, and we don't have to get into this right now, they were more dispensable. So even though enslavement and times of slavery were awful, these individuals, because they were leasing these men, if they killed them, they didn't have to buy another one. They just leased another one for the same price. And so the beatings became horribly worse, because if you're a slave owner, if you kill your enslaved person, you have to make another larger purchase. So you just beat them to the brink of death. These men were dying not over and over, but left and right. And so when we look at the business continuity and we look at kind of the nature of America, these are two infographics that speak about the total number of lynchings or reported lynchings from 1882 to 1968. And I just wanted to put this juxtaposed to the executions by state from 1977 to 2013. You may notice some commonalities. Again, I'll let you interpret that for yourself, but I thought it'd be valuable to drop in there strategically right now. And so when we look at the war on drugs and we look at the Rockefeller drug laws and we look at what's happening currently with how we're treating the crack epidemic, how we're currently treating the opiate epidemic and the crack epidemic, the stop and frisk laws and the marijuana taxes, we don't have time to dig into all these, but these are constructs that you would look at to understand a support of this kind of trail that I'm creating right now, this trail of evidence. These are additional bullet points for you to look up and pay attention to that support that evidence. And so let's look at drug scheduling for a moment. Are you guys familiar with that the government kind of creates a schedule of drugs that determines, what's really illegal and what's kind of illegal? And so marijuana is a Schedule I drug. And it goes Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 being like testosterone. Literally, Schedule 4 is listed as testosterone. So let's look at some of these drugs listed as Schedule 2 drugs. And remember, Schedule 2 means I'm less dangerous than Schedule 1. Does that make sense to everybody? Right. It makes sense, but I don't get it. Anybody see the movie Big with Tom Hanks? And I was like, I don't get it. Right? And so I love that meme because it's one of my favorite movies. But we have, meth, oxycodone, fentanyl is safer than marijuana according to the government. So this is how the government is scheduled. Again, I am just trying to build the case for you all that there is a business continuity model associated with what's happening, and you all have a responsibility, if you're interested in gaining wealth in this area, to see that this is a part of that business continuity model and make a deliberate decision to do something about it. Fair enough? So let's keep going for a few minutes. Now, when we talk about marijuana, when we talk about cannabis, which what it was historically called in America until it was vilified and connected to Mexico and given the name marijuana, it was always referred to as cannabis. In fact, the people who first came, the colonists, grew hemp extensively. Now, it wasn't necessarily heavily used recreationally, but they grew it extensively, and they referred to it as cannabis sativa. It did not become marijuana until we added to the deliberate business continuity plan to identify groups of people, to vilify who we could oppress, who we could utilize to build the global economy or to maintain the global economy. Now, somebody's sitting there, and I said I was going to check in. Somebody said, you don't have to raise your hand. But somebody's sitting there saying, this dude is a conspiracy theorist. That laughter is because it's true for someone, but I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a social scientist, right? I have a doctorate degree in clinical psychology, so I research and I understand people and I understand systems. I realized I couldn't work one-on-one with people anymore because I realized I didn't care about people individually, and that's an important characteristic for a psychologist. And so I'm not licensed. I don't practice anymore because I sit in front of people like, I just need you to do this, this, and this. I don't have time to really, So I'm here, and I don't really care about your feelings because this content is so critically important. But I did want to check in so that you can do that. And now, just to be very honest, academic research demonstrates adding comedy to really heavy topics helps to make it absorb a little bit more easier, helps to make it more palatable. And because this is so important, I do want people to be able to palate what it is that we're talking about. So you take it back to your individual spaces and you say, I heard this guy talk today. I don't believe all the shit he said, but some of it was pretty good. And so, So when we look at the history of cannabis in America and we look at how it's been weaponized to necessarily and specifically marginalize and disenfranchise people of color, there's a lot of different pieces here. But for me, this time right here, and we see this propaganda that began to come about speaking about marijuana. So weed and the roots of hell, not recommended for children. Now, I do agree with that. However, smoke that gets into the youth's eyes, weird orgies. Wow, this is real propaganda that was created. So we know what propaganda is, right? Propaganda is deliberately used to kind of sell a story, right? America's done a good job of that, right? And when we talk about convict leasing and all those kind of business continuity models, there was a lot of propaganda to make black men dangerous and scary. And so it worked. And suddenly the convict leasing program worked. Same thing with marijuana. They begin to create these ads and begin to do this. So cannabis has been here since the 1850s. As I said, it was the early anti-immigrant stance against Mexico that really, really, really brought this to light. And so another business continuity model. We got all these people coming from the border. Sounds oddly familiar. What are we going to do? We need to attach something to them that scares people from letting them come into our country. We took it. It's not really ours. And so when we look at how these things work, the government, the systems of the world began to attach dangers that weren't really totally accurate. Now, I'm sure somebody in the history of the world has kirked out over smoking a joint. I'm positive about it. But my imagination also tells me that someone in here smoked marijuana and they woke up this morning and they were just fine. They were just fine. And so this gentleman right here, Harry Anslinger, is the primary individual who was responsible for the criminalization of marijuana in the United States. This is a quote from him to Congress. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. And some of them are overlap. There's some intersectionality there, too. Some Hispanic Filipinos. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. The marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and others. Reefer makes darkies think they are as good as white men. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. This is in 1930. The marijuana tax happened in 1937, and this gentleman, Harry Anslinger, was the first commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics, which is now the DEA. Look him up. I'm not making this up. This is a direct quote, verbatim. And so what happens next is we begin to continue the propaganda. And notice something very specific in all these ads. Now, I'm not attempting to vilify white women, but what I will say, historically, white women have been idolized and utilized as a trophy of winning everything. And as a result, a lot of racist opportunities have been predicated upon, whether true or false, the victimization of a white woman. And I'm not saying that to be coy. I'm saying that to say, if you were to look at the evidence of black towns that were burnt down, if you were to look at the evidence of laws that were passed, it was largely based on maintaining the sanctity of white women. That's nothing against white women in this room right now. And I just want to ask everybody again to check in on how you feel when you hear that, because it's a truth that doesn't feel good, but it's a truth. And when you look at these particular ads and this particular propaganda, again, you see it here. Beware if this is handed to you by a friendly stranger. It contains the killer drug, marijuana. And again, we weren't using the word marijuana until early 1910. Before then, it was cannabis sativa. When we began the propaganda to connect it specifically to Mexican immigrants, it became marijuana, and then we began connecting it to these particular industries. Strategically, again, this is a part of the business continuity model. And so when we look at American support of marijuana legalization, we're right now at the highest we've ever been. We're at 64% of Americans say, yes, this is a Gallup poll. You may not believe in Gallup polls, but it's a poll. And so when we look at it based on political affiliation, we're saying that Democrats see 72%, and right now is the first time, 2017 was the first time that for Republicans, support for marijuana legalization has gone above 50%. It's at 51% right now. And so when we look at the states, and the statuses that they have, we see in blue those states that have legalized it. I guess some of these states do feel like individual countries sometimes, so maybe that's where I'm going with that. Right, exactly. So we look at what different states have done. The D stands that they decriminalize it, which means that you can't go to jail for it. It's kind of like a parking ticket in some cases, which has not historically been the case. So who smokes marijuana? Don't raise your hand. That was not a prompt. That was not a prompt for anybody to raise their hand. But what we know is that groups across all ethno-linguistic groups in America smoke marijuana at kind of a similar level. If you just spent 30 minutes with your car, like acting like you're reading a book, I've never done this, outside of a dispensary to watch who's walking in and out, you just see the widest swath of people, from an 85-year-old white woman with a walker to a 60-year-old black woman with a jerry curl to whatever, right? Right, you just see everybody. And so marijuana use, 18 to 25-year-olds, we see about equal use, about at the same rate. But what we know is that individuals who are being incarcerated as a result of marijuana use, in spite of this same deal, are so disparate and so disproportionate. In many cases, a juvenile who was locked up over the last 3 decades oftentimes was locked up for an original charge of a marijuana charge, a possession charge, not even a distribution or a sales charge. And so some of you may look at this stat and say, well, those are people who use it, not who sell it. Well, those aren't the primary ones getting locked up. Primary ones getting locked up are those who have possession. Blacks have been nearly 4 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana possession. We're not talking about selling. We're talking about just having a bag of weed in your pocket. Now, some people would say, can't still be going on today. And you look at this. For those of you who don't know, this construct is called disparity. Can you say it with me? Disparity. Another way we can call it is disproportionality. Can you say it with me? Disproportionality. We're saying that these groups of individuals consume this product at a same rate. However, when we look at who's being incarcerated for it, we're seeing 4 times the rate. Business continuity. Business continuity. And so when we look at other places, we see even a larger gap than places like Iowa, D.C., Minnesota, and Illinois, where black people were 7.5 times to 8.5 times more likely to be locked up. And we just said earlier, the average is 4 times more likely. That's a huge disparity. And if anyone knows, that we don't have time to get into the revolving door of the incarceration system, but if anybody's ever worked in juvenile justice or seen an episode of Scared Straight or Law and Order or whatever court cop show you watch, once you're in that door, it is hard to get out. Business continuity. If the goal of incarceration was rehabilitation, they wouldn't look like what they look like. Business continuity. Again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I just take evidence and put it together to tell a story, and that's what I'm here to do today. And this is the story that we're talking about today. Most of the people police are arresting aren't kingpins, but those with just small amounts of pot. 52% of all drug arrests in 2010 were for marijuana. So I started leaving it at 2010 because I said, well, it's been being legalized around now, so arrests have to be going down, right? Right? Nope. Surprise. The number of people arrested for marijuana law violations in 2017 was 659,700. Those charged with marijuana violations were 90% of that group. Busts for cannabis sales and manufacturing dropped in 2016 from 2016 to 2017. So busts for sales and manufacturing dropped, but look what didn't. Between 2014 and 2016, 80% of pot arrests were black and Latino. And, I forgot to add the other one. Can't think of the percentage right now, but the number of arrests for possession actually went up from 2014 to 2016, in spite of the number for manufacturing went down. So I wish I would have had that, because that was like the key point right there. So at a time when more than 100 deaths per day are caused by opioid overdose, it is foolish to focus our limited law enforcement resources on a drug that has caused literally zero. Now, have people died from marijuana overdoses? Yes, that is has happened? Have there been instances where individuals gain heavy addictions to marijuana? Yes, that has happened. Marijuana has a high psychological addiction and a low physiological addiction, but that doesn't mean it's not addictive. And so we can't say that, oh, this is great. But when we look at what's happening with alcohol and tobacco and all those other drugs, this is not posing as high of a risk. And this gentleman right here is speaking directly to that. So what can a cannabis charge cost you? And how do we talk about intergenerational advantage versus intergenerational disadvantage? How much more time do I have? 5, perfect. And then that's not 5 minutes for questions. Okay, perfect. And so when we look at what happens with these charges, you say, oh, you get a marijuana charge and you get out and just go get a job. Not necessarily. There are men right now serving life in prison for a marijuana charge. Now, for some of them, it was kind of the third strike rules that happened. Business continuity. For others, there were some parole violations that may have happened. Business continuity. And they're still locked up for something that is not even illegal anymore in many places. And the federal government is now looking at it as well. So public housing, if you attempt to I used to run a homeless program in El Monte for the county, and we would have people filling out Section 8 applications. Anybody know what a Section 8 application is? Some of you may own Section 8 properties. So a Section 8 application is something, see, I'm hitting the nails on the head today. It's important to know your audience. And so Section 8 properties, for those of you who don't know, it provides low-income housing for individuals where the government pays a portion of the rent directly to the landlord, and the person who occupies the place pays a smaller portion. And there will be so many of my clients who were disallowed from Section 8 benefits because of a criminal charge. You couldn't move into a housing project, and that's a whole nother conversation. Maybe I'll come back next month to talk about that. But you can't move into a housing project or get public housing because you have a criminal charge. You can't get student financial aid because you have a criminal charge. You can't get certain employment opportunities. You may not have access to visitation with your children, but you still have to pay child support. Your immigration status may be compromised. These are all components of the business continuity model. In the same way that it doesn't make sense that some people who have certain felonies can't vote. It's kind of like, why not? Why did this crime make it such that you can't vote? Certainly there may be some crimes that make it such that you can't vote, but everybody? And so there are serious consequences to these things that exist intergenerationally, right? So now I'm homeless, and there's stories all over the internet that talk about people, and it's called like the aftermath of my weed charge or something like that, and how this one guy lost his driver's license because of his weed charge, and now he can't take his daughter to school, and he couldn't get a job, or it takes him 45 minutes to get to work, and just so many pieces that we don't necessarily think about. And now this. America's first cannabis cafe. So we just been talking about all this disparity, about how America has created a systematic business continuity model to maintain the oppression of a very specific ethno-gender group, right? Ethno-gender, black and brown men specifically. Now, some of you, and I know I'm a black man, so you know, this black dude talking this black stuff. Yes. Because it's important that individuals who sit in circles of influencers or who are influencers themselves understand what this brand new business is all about and work deliberately to dismantle some of those pieces. So the Hollywood Love Lowell Herb Company, along with nightclub impresarios Mark and Johnny Houston. Mark, Johnny, you here? No? Okay. Plans to unveil the West Hollywood Cafe in August, serving up an array of cannabis. You can get your olives in there. An array of cannabis, along with CBD and THC-infused cocktails and small bites. We might call those tapas in Spain. And so we're looking at the fact that West Hollywood has become the first municipality in the country that has authorized permits for recreational consuming recreational places where people can consume cannabis. Apparently, you're going to be able to smoke, you're going to be able to eat, you're going to be able to drink, you're going to be able to consume cannabis, I'm sure, in every way possible except intravenously. And if you're doing that, it's a whole nother conversation. But these people are going to make millions of dollars, billions of dollars, billions of dollars. Anybody ever been to Amsterdam? Those cafes are filled all day. People are just eating crumpets and drinking tea and smoking joints all day. This place is going to win. What are they doing to make sure that they're paying attention to the fact that generations of people have been disenfranchised? I grew up in a housing project in Buffalo and just happened to hit these different angles that allow me to be Dr. Grant in front of you today, right? But I got a lot of friends who that didn't happen for. And in many cases, it's because, dad got locked up on a weed charge in 1972 and he couldn't get a job and and then crack hit. Business continuity. And now we're in this space. And so, I was lucky. My mom and dad were still always around and I got, these strategic pieces, but it was a lot of blessings and a lot of luck. I'm calling up on you and I want to have this conversation now about what is your responsibility on remediating those concerns and making sure that we pay attention to the fact that there are deliberate and strategic efforts aimed at marginalizing black and brown men. I mean, we can talk about the pay inequality gap if this was a conversation about misogyny, and we could look at the men's and women's soccer team and say there is a deliberate strategic effort to maintain pay inequality. Like, there's all these efforts that we could talk about. This is just one. So what are we going to do to dismantle this? Oh, I got one more thing. My book... Shameless plug. My book it's a textbook. So I finished my book recently, and it's called Black Men, Intergenerational Colonialism and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations. It's a study that I did on black men in the U.S., the UK, France, and Canada, and seeing similar outcomes. I built a case demonstrating that their participation in colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade created current ecologies that make it such that black men are dying from diabetes when you don't have to die from diabetes, or over incarcerated, over policed, blah, 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 and what to do about it. So check it out. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you, Donald. That's so informative. To have a strong community and strong innovation, we have to have information like that. And so I'm very, very grateful for you to come out and speak with us today. We're going to open up to Q&A. We've got a few minutes for Q&A. I'm going to pass the microphone to John. This is a great time to ask a question about any of the topics he talked about. Not a great time to talk about you beating your cannabis charge or what you smoked last night. So here's John.
Fabulous talk. Could you expound a little bit on how this business continuity model ties into private prisons and what's going on with the current immigration crisis and the people that are providing the housing for profit?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so when you look at prison privatization, I mean, that's all, we could speak for hours about that. But in a nutshell, when you have a private business, you make money off of the cogs that you house and or make. And so prison privatization is identified as a business, and the more prisoners they have, the more money they make. It's a part of the business continuity model that we even moved in the direction of privatizing prisons, because now we get to get in cahoots with judges. And you guys have seen that there's certain judges who have been being paid to funnel young people into these privatized prisons very clearly and very deliberately. And another piece of that is that the people who, if you ever sat at a table with people who run private prisons, one of the ways in which they identify where their market is, like, if you're going to build a McDonald's, you have to do like an environmental scan and know where your next McDonald's or Subway needed to be, right? Have you ever thought about how they do that with prisons, how they do an environmental scan to know where they need to build a prison? 3rd and 4th grade reading attrition rates of black and brown boys. That is their rubric to determine location for privatized prisons. Again, another part of the business continuity model. Yes, sir.
So as you talk about social responsibility, and I know there are a handful of realtors in the city that is, I think, the second in the country to start busing in the 70s. I'll open the door to you, because you mentioned real estate earlier. there are some new statistics coming out on things like we've got a history of redlining, but we also have what's called now the Scarlet E for evictions. And when you have an eviction, the ability for you to find new, inexpensive housing goes through the roof. And as a result, the numbers I'm seeing lately are that business owners who own housing are charging at or above market rates for the additional risk, and as a result, they're making 3 to 4 times the profit margin on me going down the street and renting a $4,000 a month apartment, which has maybe a 5 or 10% market rate. But if I go to South Central, so have you done and looked at any of those pieces as part of this social responsibility portion?
Yeah, housing, I mean, when you look at the history of redlining, and Pasadena has a really rich history of redlining. If you ever do that research, it's really, really rich. But the housing market, and when we talk about the recent conversations on rent control, particularly in certain unincorporated areas in Southern California, it's a big deal. So I can't answer your question so succinctly, but we know that housing is a problem. We know that certain reasons why you're unable to qualify for housing is a problem. And so those are all things that people need to pay attention to. I'm not saying you just, give your place away for free, but there's certain models, mixed use spaces, mixed income spaces. The housing project model we have to get away from. The housing project model creates what I call them, this monolith of thought. Everybody there, nobody in my neighborhood growing up knew how to fill out a financial aid form because nobody in my immediate community had that experience. And so when we create that, it's a bad idea.
Powerful stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I was also wondering, in terms of the taxes on marijuana, and then I think there's also some prohibitive costs to get into the business now that they've legalized it. I was just, and the impact that has on changing the color and the makeup of who are business owners in this area, and if you could speak to that.
Yeah, and so there is a huge jump to get in the game, right? You just can't walk in, and because it's not federally legal and there's no loans supported by the FDIC to start up, you got to have some capital to jump in this game, and you have to have a lot of capital. You also have to have some political connections, because remember when the dispensaries first opened, there were hundreds there was one on every corner, and then they shut them all down. And they said, nope, there needs to be some regulation surrounding this. And so what we see is this huge influx of people who have already benefited from intergenerational wealth and affluence who are able to gain first bids and access to it. And what we're not doing a good job is making sure that individuals who have been disenfranchised by it are being able to get a piece of the pie, right? How do you support somebody else jumping in who has been disenfranchised from this?
Just one point and one question. I think Blackman pointed out in his book that slavery actually went until 1950 or 51. There was a Texas Supreme Court case about slavery. 53.
Yeah.
And then the question is, what's the main takeaway, the main point that you would like people to remember for today? Is there an action item or
Yeah, the call to action. The call to action is, so like when we look at that beautiful space that's in West Hollywood, right? When we look at this beautiful, beautiful building, the call to action is, how do you, as some of the people in the room who have money to influence something, how do you go to the president of the Chamber of Commerce of Pasadena and say, you're about to get another $5 million thrown into your income. How are you going to make it such that is specifically aimed at supporting reentry programs for individuals who have been incarcerated? How are you, as a business owner who's building this beautiful business, going to put into your, in film we use writers, but into your whatever it's called, to say that 12% of everybody I hire is going to have a criminal record or be part of a reentry program? How are you all going to work with individual businesses to say that we need to deliberately identify and seek out in this particular industry individuals who have been negatively impacted by the illicit cannabis industry while I'm about to make $1 billion on it? How do I bring in at least 12% of my staff to remediate that? That's literally what I'm asking you to do. Now that you have this context, I'm hoping you see the value and why that's important to do. And when you begin becoming entrepreneurs on this or investors on this, and you can say to somebody, if you want my $2.1 million, I'm going to need to see this. You can do that. They're not going to say, oh, no, I don't want your $2.1 million. They still want your money. But because you're bringing it in, you can bring it in and say, this is what I require.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure how to ask this question. Isn't big tobacco behind some of this because they've lost such a population of cigarette smokers? You need users to succeed at this. And I'm just wondering because that's deep in slavery as well. Is that part of, you don't hear about it, but I'm just wondering myself how, because I've seen a lot of people with wealth getting kind of knocked out of the picture because they don't have that kind of tobacco money wealth. Mm-hmm. And I just don't know if it's...
I'm not sure either. It doesn't feel like it's highly vested inside the tobacco industry. I think when this industry hit, there was already a pre-existing fan base for cannabis that they didn't need the tobacco people for that. And most of the... places growing it, I think that the landscape for growing both don't coincide, and so it's a totally different skill set. And so I don't know, to be honest with you. Yeah, could be. I'm not sure. Yes.
2 more questions.
All right.
Okay, to address the disparity and the opportunity, I just wanted to say there is a group in Los Angeles. It's called Green Believers, and so they have
say the name of it again.
Green Believer.
Green Believers. Okay.
Yes, and so they have a program specifically to help the illegal become legal. So they have a whole training program. They teach them the whole licensing, all the licensing requirements, and so it's a really good program to address that disparity.
Awesome. Thank you for that resource.
Last question.
Actually, it's not a question, but an addition to your call to action with some better direction as opposed to the Chamber of Commerce. Great organization, but they don't have that much power. The reality is that because I'm on an advisory board for a local cannabis company coming in, that they actually contact nonprofit organizations and offer to share their profits with them. And one of the groups that they in particular are interested in are veterans. So I think that if there were a nonprofit organization that was specific to your cause, not go to the Chamber of Commerce, but go to the people that are going to be making all of the money and get them to use some of their profits, because that is part of, in order to get into a city, they have to show their commitment to the community. And so that would be the perfect vehicle for you.
I love that idea. That's another great idea that you could utilize to make sure that the wealth being built from this brand new industry, that we're paying attention to the burden that existed prior to it being a wealth building opportunity. And keep in mind, one of the reasons why it's going to be such a wealth building opportunity is actually in some ways because of all that has come before it. Now, imagine if all this drama hadn't existed about marijuana prior to right now, probably wouldn't be this $1 million industry, because it would have already grown kind of slowly and succinctly. But because of the disparity, it's created larger disparity. Again, thank you all for coming out so early in the morning for this talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.